All right, well, let's get into it. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I know there are a ton of amazing sessions happening today, so I'm very grateful that you have chosen this one specifically to join me in. I really want this just to be as much of an open discussion as we can have. Please utilize the chat here, use direct messages to have conversation. I want this to be as two-way as we can possibly make it. And hopefully you can take a couple tidbits away from this, but as we are learning all together and sharing our own experiences, it's just going to be that much more valuable for everyone. So as we get into it, quick agenda for the day. I'll give a brief intro on myself, and then we're going to define bias. What does unconscious bias mean? What are the different types of unconscious bias and how it shows up? And then we're going to have a moment to identify our own unconscious bias. Don't be too nervous. No one is going to know. This is really just for our own learning and reflection on ourselves. And then we're going to dive into a couple of case studies on how unconscious bias has showed up in design in the digital world. And then lastly, a very brief practical application into how we can use our understanding of our own unconscious bias to change what we do in our work and in our workplace to hopefully create more inclusive products and inclusive design. So first, hello, I am Lydia Knoll. I use the pronouns she, her. I am born and raised a Hoosier, graduated from Indiana University with 2 bachelor's degrees, a bachelor in marketing and a bachelor in sports management. Have always been a sports enthusiast, absolutely loved playing sports, watching sports, was a fan of multiple different teams, and pretty much knew my whole life that that's what my career was going to be in the future. Didn't know exactly what that meant or how I was going to show up in the sports world, but just knew I wanted to be in the sports environment and I loved the energy. I have also, and we talked about this briefly if you were on a couple minutes early, but I'm in school right now at University of Notre Dame pursuing a dual degree with an MBA and an MGA. So looking into a strategy concentration with a sustainable development concentration. And we'll get into that here in a second of why that makes sense in my career journey. But first I want to talk to my professional experience before coming back to school. And that was about 4 years at Adidas. So I started at Adidas in brand communications, working in a role with our NCAA partnerships, and then transitioned to the digital organization and was working as what we call a digital publisher, managing all of the digital content across several of our digital channels, specifically for US sports. Was highly involved in the photo shoots of those digital content materials and the publication of some of the materials and coordinating across digital channels what our overall strategy for US sports was going to look like. I absolutely loved just the overall speed and innovation of the digital world. I had the chance to experiment with some new VR and AR technologies in its early days, using Snapchat lenses and some of the new Instagram filters and things like that. And I just loved how it was constantly evolving, and new things were happening every day, as I'm sure you all are familiar with. And then COVID hit, and that really changed my world and my day-to-day life. I was spending a ton of time on my computers, as I'm sure you all were as well, on my phone, and really started to feel a bit disconnected from the impact that my work was having, and wanted to seek out some better opportunities or some different opportunities that better aligned to my personal values. So ended up coming across the North America Purpose team that was in a position right mid-2020, as I'm sure we all remember the tragic murder of George Floyd in the Black Lives Matter movement. And Adidas had made a very public statement about how they were going to respond to this and how they were going to become what we called united against racism. And I was watching this evolve inside the brand and really felt a strong sense that I wanted to support that kind of work. I felt compelled to help that team as much as possible. They come from a diverse family and have witnessed some experiences from historically marginalized communities at a very close distance, and wanted to do whatever I could to educate myself and to be a part of the work at the brand. And so ended up getting a role on the team as a project manager. And my specific project was rolling out a new digital platform that was going to house all of our community programming and education materials in a virtual environment. And so I was able to really utilize my digital background and build this platform specifically for the Black and Latinx community in a way that centered their experiences and their voices on a platform to further educate other individuals in their own communities. And so spent a couple years building up that platform. The platform continues to grow and reiterate right now, but I have since moved into a bit more of a strategy role and am going to be supporting some different projects moving forward and get to just cheer on the new platform team from a bit more of a distance. But excited for that. And that's where a lot of this work today that I'll share with you is stemming from, was really my passion for building for that community and the learnings that I have taken from that experience. I'm going to take a quick pause here because based on what I've already shared with you, I'm sure you are starting to conjure up some of your own perhaps assumptions or stereotypes about myself. And because this is a workshop about unconscious bias, I wanted to throw a couple of fun facts at you that maybe are unexpected or might not fit into what those assumptions and stereotypes might be that you're thinking. So a couple of things. The first is that I love to bake. I learned at a very young age that if I helped my mom bake the cake and bake the cookies, that I got to eat more of them. So that has continued as a trend through my life. And I'm also an intermediate knitter, which I don't share with many audiences. So feel privileged, I guess, to hear that information about me. But I learned from my Oma when I was about 6 or 7 years old how to knit and have been doing it ever since. So wanted to share those tidbits with you just as a way for us to reflect on some of the assumptions that we might make about individuals and how they can always surprise us when we learn more. Now we're going to get into it. So some of those assumptions that you might have made could have been driven by one of these 6 different biases. We're going to run through each of these pretty quickly here at a high level, but I first wanted to mention this book that I've quoted at the top of the page. Blind Spot is an incredible book if you haven't had a chance to read it. It's rooted in science and speaks to the psychology behind unconscious bias. Its whole mission is trying to determine why do good people, individuals that are trying to do the best that they can, be as kind as they can, still have these deep-rooted unconscious biases. And the book really talks to the psychology of the human brain and evolution and why that has come to be. I've linked everything here on the slide, but we'll also share links at the end for any resources that are mentioned throughout. So if that's of interest, please definitely take a look. But running through these 6 different biases, the first is confirmation bias. We're all probably likely familiar with confirmation bias, but this occurs in many different ways when we are seeking information or limiting our information intake to information that we already believe, to something that will agree with our current thought process, with our current understanding of something. It's when we limit the research that we're doing to just support our own argument or our own perspective, and therefore is not a complete picture of other perspectives or other information that might contradict what we believe. And then there is optimistic bias. Optimistic bias is when we underestimate the risk or the harm that could come from an action that we take or not taking an action. This is when, to the point, optimism, when we are a bit too optimistic about the outcomes of something and we're not taking full consideration of how it could impact someone else. And then omission bias happens when we believe that by not taking an action, it's better than taking a intentionally harmful action. And while that might seem intuitive or true in most cases, it actually is not always the case. And omission bias is largely a reason for the societal oppressions that we see in our culture today, because people and the systemic barriers that we have are omitting or not able to take action or not taking an action to change something. And therefore, we continue to fall into the same systems that we have of harm to other individuals. False consensus bias is essentially when we believe that other individuals have the same thought processes as ourselves and don't think about other different experiences other individuals might bring to a room. There's a quote that a lot of people use when referring to false consensus is that you are not the user. So we might often be more likely to design something for ourselves or based on what we would want a product to look like on our own experiences. But false consensus just recognizes that not everyone is going to experience it the same way as you or have the same thought process as you. And so we have to design for who that end user is and not always for ourselves. Perception bias. This is stereotyping. So taking a perception of an individual, a stereotype of someone, of a group of people, and believing that to be the truth about someone else that you meet. And then the last one of the 6 is status quo. And this is where we believe that the status quo is the best way of doing things, and we don't have a desire to change it. We want to continue doing what we've always done because it's always worked, and we don't see the potential of even greater benefit that could come if we change what that status quo is. Wanted to share a quick quote with you from Benjamin Evans. I know a lot of talk around the design world is human-centered design or design thinking, and Benjamin Evans posed a really powerful question in a podcast he spoke on and just said, which human is placed at the center of human design, and who are we missing? So as we go through the rest of the workshop today, I want us to keep this thought in the back of our mind as we are designing for humans and we're really trying to think about the human experience. Who is that human that's at the center of our design? And when we look at that human, are there others on the outskirts that are not included in that image that we have of who we're designing for? All right, so just a quick caveat here that this workshop is obviously going to go beyond ADA and WCAG to really dig a little bit deeper into our unconscious biases. It is incredibly important that we are abiding to ADA and WCAG, but there also is more work that can go above and beyond that to ensure intersectional accessibility to our platforms, to our designs, to any of our digital products that we are creating. So to address our own unconscious biases, if you have a phone accessible, I would like you all to scan this QR code, and this is going to take you to what's called an implicit association test. If you scroll down to the bottom of the screen, once you get there, and I'll give you a couple minutes at the end here, but if you scroll down to the bottom, click proceed if you're interested. That will give you a list of different tests to take, and what these tests are going to hopefully reveal in some way or another is our implicit associations, hence the name implicit association, but our own internal correlation between certain subjects or certain items and other words. So a lot of times it's associating words or an image with something that is good or something that is bad. And it's a speed game. And so it really wants to see what is your first initial reaction in your brain to these different images and associations. And from that, it can then tell you if perhaps there's a little bit of an unconscious bias that leans one way or another based on your response to some of these tests. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds to pull that up, scroll through the many different lists or many different tests in that list that it gives you. And if you want to start one and take one now, that's great. If you want to wait and do it later, you just want to start a couple of questions, go at your own pace, but I'll give you a couple of minutes now to do that. So hopefully you've at least been able to see the list of different tests and get one started. I don't know if it's probably not enough time to finish one completely right now, but to ensure that I'm respectful of everyone's time here, we're going to keep moving. Hopefully if you want to finish one of those tests later or come back to it, you absolutely can, and we will share this resource at the end in the chat as well. So getting into a couple of case studies, we want to look at how unconscious bias has shown up in the design world and caused products that actually really limited access to them or created barriers for individuals. The first is in our speech to text. So there are several different large tech companies that use this feature. If any of you are avid Siri users, like my mother who loves her Siri speech to text, you've probably encountered at least one of these tech companies' speech-to-text capabilities. And what we have actually found is that the speech-to-text tool has a limited feature in interpreting different communities' dialects of language. And so it actually misinterprets a lot of the words that they use. This graph is a study that was conducted by professors at Stanford and at Georgetown. And they analyzed 19 hours of audio to come up with some of these findings. And what they saw was that this average WERE, that stands for the average word error rate, what they found was that the audio from Black individuals actually had almost twice as high of an error rate as white individuals. And you can see this is consistent across all 5 of these big tech companies. Microsoft had the closest performance, with Apple here on the left at the biggest discrepancy between the two. And what is really causing this is in the data that the AI machines are trained on. And so a lot of the data and information given to these AI machines really focuses the white voice, white speech, and dialect. And so AI has a harder time than understanding different dialects when it's asked to interpret to text. And so this is one way where limiting our research diversity and our communities of data collection has really impacted the way that these tools can show up for other communities. And even though this tool was something that was built for people with a certain disability who are hard of hearing and really can help those individuals, we have to be mindful of intersectionality across communities. So we can't just build for one community, but how do we ensure that communities that are intersectional from multiple different aspects still have equitable access and equitable success with using these certain tools? So I thought this was a pretty stark example of how that shows up. And it's something to be mindful of if you're including any sort of speech to text capabilities in your own products, in your own work. Are there ways that we can mitigate this or improve upon this in the future so that other users that are interacting with it will have a better experience? The second one is in personal info, and this comes in several different formats. I'm going to talk specifically to name, but I also want to touch on gender and race, of course. In a ton of different digital platforms, you're asked to fill out your basic personal info. You list your name, gender, maybe a race, an email, etc. And a lot of those things can be very limiting for individuals that identify intersectionally or as a historically marginalized community member. Things like gender that ask you to identify specifically between male or female really leaves out a lot of our LGBTQI plus community members. And things like race, where individuals might identify with multiple races, but you're asked to just select one, really leaves out diverse community members. And then this last example of a name was one that was a little unexpected to me, honestly, when I came across this. Back in about 2014, there was an automated sweep across Facebook and Instagram that was trying to identify usernames that they perceived as not real names, users that maybe were posing as someone else or that had just created a fake account, and they wanted to clean up the platform of all those names. And what they found is that the database that this AI platform to identify these usernames was based on was a very European-rooted name data set. And so it was flagging all of these other names that were potentially real names of users, or potentially names that a user now went by, even if they hadn't gone through a legal name changing process. And so a lot of these individuals that were targeted were transgender individuals, are drag queen individuals, and indigenous tribe members. So it was a bit of an uproar when that happened. And then on the other hand, MasterCard recognized this, and a few years later decided that they were going to do something different. And they launched what they called this true name card, which allowed individuals to put whatever name they so desired on their MasterCard and ensured their safety when they were out using their card and perhaps were mistaken by another individual or stereotyped by someone else. It kept their safety and ensured that they were comfortable in whatever name that they were displaying publicly. So I wanted to show a super quick video about the MasterCard example so that you can see this in real life. So there you have it. I want to double check and make sure, was everyone able to hear the audio on that? No comments, so I'm hoping that the audio came through, hopefully. Great, so moving on to photography. There are a couple of examples within this photography bucket actually that we'll speak to. And the first is as it pertains to skin tone. And actually, let me back up. Before I even get to these examples, I want to preface that, of course, representation through photography and imagery is incredibly important in any sort of digital environment and marketing materials, etc. We want to ensure that all communities feel like they are seen and can see themselves using the product and in those environments that we are marketing to. And to go a step further in some of those marketing materials, or as we are creating digital content for some of our products, one thing to be mindful of is the skin tone that comes across in photography. And so I'll read this quick quote here, but it just says the inherent biases that overlooked diversity in skin tones during the film photography area, which happens back in about 1950s, were baked into the foundation of the digital camera systems. And this article really just talked about how deep-rooted biases that we've had for years and years have continued to lead to systemic barriers in even our modern day photography and modern day cameras that we have. And so recognizing that there is a barrier there, and if we are to accurately and authentically use imagery from these communities, that we need to ensure it's done correctly and in a way that they feel proud of. And so right now, the exposure systems to cameras better suit lighter skin tones than they do darker skin tones. But thankfully, Google is trying to change that and has taken a step with their most recent Pixel, well, I shouldn't say most recent, but one of their more recent phones, Pixel 6, and they have used what they're calling this real tone, which uses a 10 shade scale that was developed by this Harvard professor to better represent all of the skin tones that we see in society today. And this is absolutely not perfect by any means, but this is a huge step from where it was. And by incorporating this 10 shade scale into their camera capabilities, the camera is better able to identify the skin tones in a picture and adjust the lighting and settings accordingly so that individuals feel like they are most accurately represented and they can feel the best authentic selves in the images that they take. And there is another couple of videos here that will speak to this example, because I think actually seeing it in real life and seeing some examples for me was at least super helpful.
Lydia, we're not able to hear the audio on this one.
Oh, okay. Were you able to hear the last one?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we can share the link for this one. Let me try the next one and see if that one plays perhaps. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
The audio is quite choppy on this one as well. Oh, maybe it's because your screen share mic is muted?
Okay. How might I change that? Let me see here.
The gears icon at the bottom of the screen should give you your audio settings. No.
Oh, hang on. 1 second. Sorry, y'all. Let's see. Built-in. Oh. The only option it gives me is the built-in microphone. So if it doesn't come through that, I'm not sure how else to change it. Music. Bummer. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I'm not sure why that is not working so well. A noise canceling option. Great question. I am entirely sure about that, but I can summarize for you what the videos say, and we can drop the links in and share them back with you all so you can see them. But the first was some Google individuals, some of the lead product designers, actually explaining why this was an important feature for Google to implement and how they had learned to kind of what I spoke about earlier, how they had learned about their camera not being able to capture individuals in different lighting settings and how it washed out different skin tones or didn't accurately portray the variety of skin tones that we see. And so they implemented this feature into the camera, and hopefully you got to see a couple, at least of the examples that it showed the before and after photos of what that looked like and the effect that that had of just being able to portray the individuals in their best, as their best selves and in a better lighting, literally better lighting. And then, oh yeah, sorry, I'm reading the chat. And then the second video was an actual user explaining his experience with the Pixel 6 and what it was like to capture those photos. He really just vouched for Google, saying that it made a world of a difference to him, and he could see the difference in the photos that he was taking. And then he also spoke to the actual data set that Google used when training the Pixel 6 versus some of their earlier versions, and said that the data set ended up being 25 times more diverse when training the Pixel 6 than it had been for earlier versions. And that just speaks to the extreme lack of diversity that has been built into some of the early models and some continuing models from other brands that we see in cameras and photography, and also the large gap that we need in order to get somewhere better. So thinking about diversifying a data set 25x what it currently was, that is truly going to be what is needed to make a change like this in the industry level. So hopefully you can watch both of those on your own time here later, but we will go ahead and, oh no, 1 minute here. Get us to the next slide, maybe. Oh. Sorry guys, 1 minute. Let me jump out and jump back in. Okay. Are we good? Let me double check. Oh. Okay. Are we good now? Looks like it. All right. Sorry, y'all. Continuing with photography, there is another AI capability, or lack thereof of a capability, that has been discovered. This comes a bit more recently as we're using AI to filter photos through things like passport uploads or driver license images and that sort of thing. And this is an example of an individual who had uploaded his photo and it was rejected because the AI believed that the subject's eyes were closed. They are obviously not, and we can see that when we look at it, but just another example of the limitations with AI and how it was likely that this AI system was not completely trained with a very diverse data sets to recognize these individuals that might have different facial appearances than the historically white individual does. And so it is increasingly important that those data sets and the research that is done to train the AI recognizes a variety of individuals and their facial features. Another example of that comes into play with photo classification. So this is something that a lot of social media platforms and even search engines are using to identify certain objects in photos or to flag different photos as potentially risky or inappropriate for a platform. So this was an example shared by Gianluca Maro, and he wrote an article for The Guardian about his research in this area, but he had posted these two exact copy pieces to LinkedIn. So you can't read the entire copy because it gets cut off, but what he says is very similar for both of the posts, but he uses different images for each. And he sees that his post of the women on the left was essentially shadow banned, was suppressed from a large audience that he normally gets, which you can see on the right through his post of the women's basketball player. And so it just goes to show how a lot of these AI systems are trying to recognize and classify certain images into certain buckets. They're labeling them as inappropriate, as risky, as racy. And there's another video in here I'll skip because I doubt that one will play either. But there's another video if you want to watch later of Gianluca actually talking about his research and some specific examples where they were using the Google AI system and Microsoft's AI system to rate different photos based on what they called the raciness. And this essentially is like a racy or a sexual appeal to the photos. And they found that by large, the systems would objectify the photos of women and identify them as more racy or more controversial than photos of men, even when men had their shirt off or when they were lifting or oiled up, whatever. It continually thought that the photos of women were more racy, and in that way objectified the female body in several different ways that he talks about. So just another risk that we see when we are using any sort of these AI algorithms across social media platforms or image searches. If a AI system like this is built into your own products and your own platforms, just being aware of that risk and trying to mitigate that. It really has negative consequences on women who have a certain career in photography, for example. That was one of the women that was quoted in the Guardian article. Was she was a photographer of mothers who were pregnant, and those images were often flagged and suppressed in several different social media posts. And so her work was then suppressed, and she was not able to get to as large of an audience and get as much new work as she wanted. And that's just one example of many where something like this could be harmful to individuals. So we'll skip the video and go into quick practical applications. So those were three different and kind of broad examples of case studies and how unconscious bias has showed up in the design space, but there's a lot of consistencies across all of them. And I really wanted to take a second to just tie all the consistencies together and speak to how we take this information and actually apply it to our work to make a difference, to make a change, and ensure that we are inclusive in what we're designing. The first and probably most talked about is in hiring. It really is crucial that the teams that are building these projects represent a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of communities, a diversity of abilities. Having the voices in the room itself to speak to their own experiences and to speak to their own community's experiences is truly the most important way that a product is designed inclusively. Within hiring or beyond hiring, you have to think about all the different parts of the organization that are going to touch the product. So I know in my experience specifically, we started as probably the furthest or the earliest in the platform design process was in some of that early content capture. And that speaks specifically to the photography piece that we touched on. And so making sure that your photography team represents a diverse background. And if they don't, that they are aware of the limitations in photography and how they're capturing the content that will build the platform. And then as you move into building the platform, that you're ensuring the team that is actually building it, whether it's a platform or just one design. I keep using platform because that's my experience, but it could be just a page, just a design, whatever that is, that as you are building it out, you have individuals with diverse backgrounds to speak to their own experiences, to speak to how the imagery represents themselves and how it's placed and the language that's used actually in the design around the images, and that it accurately represents them and is understood by those communities in the best way possible. And then at the very end, as things actually start to come together and you have a true UX testing ground, that you have a team of individuals that are vetting it based on another diversity of backgrounds and abilities, specifically in that case, once it comes time to actually use a digital tool, is it accessible to everyone that wants to use it? And in what ways is it accessible or not accessible, and how do you change that? As we move into the second triangle here of research, this is going to come early on in the process as well. As you are doing research for whatever you are building, as you're talking to members about their experiences with other tools and digital applications, who are the individuals that you're talking to? And this gets back a little bit to Benjamin Evans' quote at the very beginning of who is centered at the human at the center of human design? Who do we place there? And who is missing in that conversation? And trying to be intentional about looking around our group of individuals, maybe that we use consistently, or a tool that we use consistently for research, and trying to diversify that, pulling individuals from new places to provide feedback. And ultimately, in the testing of the platform, similar to research, you are going to want another very diverse group of individuals to test whatever platform, program, tool that you are creating, whatever design that you are building, as a way to ensure that what we think will work for them actually does work for them, and that we're not falling into possibly one of our unconscious biases, like a confirmation bias or a false consensus bias, where we believe it will work because it works for us, but really testing it with a diverse group of individuals. And I think the biggest word or takeaway that I want out of this is, for all of you, is intersectional accessibility. That's really what we're going for here, is that it's accessible not only to individual groups of historically marginalized communities, but to those that intersectionally cross many of them. We all cross different groups and identities, and ensuring that the product is accessible at the most intersectional of those communities and groups is what will ensure that it can reach as many people as possible. And with that, I have one last quote here from Sandra Camacho, who has incredible resources online if you're looking to increase some of your practice and training on inclusive design. Her Sandra by Design provides a great workbook and materials for education. But she said in one of her podcasts that when you solve for one, you're solving for many. So if you think about that in sense of when you solve for one more individual, when you help one more that sits at those margins, that sits at the intersection of several different communities, you're solving for those many communities. So just being mindful of that as you go on into your design careers. And last, here is a quick resource page. I know looking at this is not helpful for all of you, so we're going to try to drop these into the chat for you to actually use. But if it's easier to screen grab or something, I guess you can try that. But hopefully just from the chat, that will be best for you to get some of those resources. Yes, thank you, Maria. And that way you can look into any of the videos that we were not able to watch. You can read any of the articles, listen to the podcast. There's a bunch of stuff there. So hopefully some of that would be of interest to you all. But with that, I'll leave the last about 7 minutes for some questions if you have them.
Alrighty, we have a question here from Oscar asking, is there any way to see the work you did with Adidas, like the project you referenced at the beginning?
Yes, there is, and I can drop that link in here. This is the current iteration, I would say. We are rebuilding continually and relaunching here in the next couple of months, but right now, this is where everything lives. So I will drop this in the chat for you all to check out. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm available there as well if you would prefer to have just a one-off conversation or inquire about something else not relevant. But thank you all for attending and for just your time.